About like all these pages just being links.
Cinderella, a timeless tale. Looking at what makes Cinderella timeless through the lens of narratology and mobility. We'll be looking at 3 different film versions of Cinderella. The first one will be the new 2015 Cinderella, and then Ever After, and then Pretty Woman. And so the basic premise for this story is a girl, a servant, a shoe, and a prince. What we're looking at is how these tales have traveled through time. So the question is what makes the story move through time? We will look at the story in Cinderella and reference the ideas of fairy tales and narratology, which then lead to the concepts of mobility and friction. Fairy tale. We're going to start with a kind of vague definition, which is a short imaginative tale with high moral and magical content. This vagueness leads to provide us the assumption that a fairy tale is somehow timeless without actually being old. Stories have a moral potential that can and should engage a child's attention. They should also be made interesting, and they require some care as damage may be inflicting them by leaving them in the wrong hands. So that means that story influences how we look at life. How we look at life is based on aesthetic judgments. And so looking at that in reference to narrative means that we make aesthetic judgments as we read, and once again, once we've finished a narrative. We make these judgments from our interpretive and ethical judgments, and this makes us an authorial audience. In respect to aesthetic judgments, they are made by actual audience about the quality of our participation as the authorial audience, which leads us to looking at story and how story incorporates the narrative. This concept explicitly reconceptualizes the notions of narrative shape so that it includes not only events and their interconnections, but also the trajectory, which means that has to do with plot dynamics. How we relate to plot dynamics is how the story is being told, and it also influences our response as an audience.
I was just playing with which one is the best. This is all Johnny's. There's 3 different formats.
Plot dynamics refer to the instabilities and complications related to characters, events, and their interconnections. Narratorial dynamics refer both to what we call tensions arising from discrepancies of knowledge, understanding, and values among author, narrator, narrative audience, and the ongoing narrative. This leads to this idea of spatial mobility, where the mobility of humans, non-humans, and objects move around both psychologically and physically, which means that we have moments where we intersect, where we hit each other. And this is where we start moving into this idea of friction, where with spatial mobilities, we move between places and time, both physically as well as psychologically. But as we encounter other people and other places, we start to maybe face new perspectives and start to see the challenges that arise, and we start making things morph, just like story, where each of these time frames have required a different retelling of this tale. So it's a timeless fairy tale that changes as it is retold to create friction in its mobility that allows it to continue to reach its audience. By reaching its audience, it's created different character dynamics, which means that it's made us reconsider the tale as the authorial audience and the person receiving this perspective. So in retelling it, it creates mobility. As a story is told, it will continue to move through society, either by oral tradition or imagination.
Yeah, I think that Google Slides is probably easier than PowerPoint, because for one thing, with PowerPoint...
So part of what makes it move, like we said before, is the audience response. Each of these retelling only finds success based on their audience's response, how the audience takes the story in, understands it in relationship to the traditional tell, as well as their culture and time. This also means that we have to take into consideration the audience response to a retelling, just looking at the new 2015 version that came out, as well as Pretty Woman. You wouldn't off the cuff think Pretty Woman was a Cinderella tale, but it is. It has all the plot dynamics. And so looking at these three different generations, they each convey a different message to its audience. And they were also told at different time periods when cultures were looking for different things. So to conclude, the constant of the plot makes the story timeless, but the change in time makes the story move. So as it's written and presented to different audiences,
Yeah, no, that's fine. You don't
we
have to
understand the characters in
change
a
it
different
or
way.
make a new one. Especially if you didn't, like Nick had his notes all written out, he probably just read from it over